The lie was not in the courage of the men, nor in the ferocity of the defense. The lie was in the ledger. They say war is chaos. But chaos I learned to master. Chaos has rules, even if they are brutal. True catastrophe begins when you recognize the enemy is not striving for victory, but merely applying an infinite volume of steel until you become a mathematical smear they need only wipe away. I sat in the bunker carved 30 feet into the sodden German earth, the nerve center of the 275th Infantry Division. It was October, but the cold here was ancient, geological. The air smelled of wet wool, spent oil, and the sharp, disinfectant sting of creosote used to treat the supporting timbers, a smell I'd come to associate with terminal illness. Outside, the steady, rhythmic bass drum of American heavy artillery guaranteed a perpetual, low-frequency tremor that rattled the maps on my desk. As the IA, the Chief of Staff, it was my job to translate the roar of the forest into actionable data, coordinates, casualty rates, expenditure. I was a professional accountant of death. I looked at the morning's damage report from the battle for Schmidt, which we had, technically, won. A fierce, 3-day engagement. American losses confirmed. 1,100 men, heavy equipment abandoned. Our losses, 317 men, 2 officers, and critically, 40,000 rounds of mixed artillery fired. A young signals officer, Lieutenant Beck, who still believed in the newspaper headlines, had placed the report on my desk with a celebratory whisper. Herr Oberstleutnant, a ratio of nearly 4-to-1. We bled them white. I merely nodded, my pen hovering over the final calculations. Bleeding them white. A beautiful, martial phrase. But Beck didn't understand the distinction between blood loss and fatal hemorrhage. The Americans lost 1,100 men. These men were already replaced. They were aboard troop transports crossing the Atlantic. They were training in untouched England. They were stepping off trucks from the unmolested factories of Pittsburgh and Chicago. Their loss was an operational cost. We lost 317 men. And the 40,000 rounds? They were gone forever. There was no factory behind the Elbe capable of producing that ammunition at the rate we needed, let alone transporting it through the gauntlet of Allied air supremacy. Our replacements were either 16-year-old boys or 50-year-old men, equipped with obsolete rifles and zero training in the necessary brutality of forest warfare. The ratio wasn't 4-to-1. The ratio was 1 irreplaceable German veteran traded for 4 replaceable American units, plus 40,000 units of ordnance that would never be seen again. Our victory was not a battle one. It was merely a contamination protocol delaying the inevitable strategic defeat. We were succeeding only in expediting our own consumption. Every triumphant report I wrote, every high-fiving dispatch sent back to the Army Group, was a clinical lie, a note on a tombstone. And my most urgent, personal duty was to ensure General Dietrich, my immediate commander, never understood the gravity of that equation. He operated on faith and rhetoric. I operated on the last few gallons of high-octane mathematics. A new message ticked through on the Hellschreiber, the mechanical heart of our deception, spitting out its thin, gray paper ribbon. Urgent. From Army Group B. I tore the tape, reading the terse, encrypted directive. General Dietrich was about to arrive for the morning brief, buzzing with the propaganda he himself had manufactured. The tape confirmed my worst fear. A new, massive American push was expected within 48 hours, and 0 new reserves had been allocated to our sector. The creosote smelled stronger now, a noxious blend of preservation and decay. I underlined the 317 casualties. We had fought successfully, and we were, definitively, losing. General Major Dietrich arrived precisely at 7 o'clock hours, not walking, but striding into the cramped operations room as if entering a torchlit amphitheater rather than a subterranean hole filled with dirt and despair. He was a perfect specimen of the Wehrmacht officer class, tall, impeccably groomed despite the mud of the forest, and radiating a certainty that was both inspiring to the young and terrifying to the professional. He ignored the constant, shuddering thud of distant artillery as background noise, the soundtrack of his success. Gentlemen, good morning. Dietrich's voice was rich and deep, designed for radio broadcasts, not for whispering tactical data. Another successful, crushing day for the 275th. I have just been speaking with Field Marshal Model. He is ecstatic. Absolutely ecstatic. He swept his gaze across the assembled staff. Major Gruber, the quiet logistics officer, who looked permanently constipated by shortages, Captain Hoffman, the weary intelligence officer, and myself, the man who held the unpleasant numbers. The Americans, Dietrich declared, thumping the map table with a gloved hand, making the artillery figurines dance, were taught a brutal lesson in German tenacity. They believed the Hurtgen was a speed bump. We have proven it is their grave. He launched into a rousing, 5-minute monologue, quoting recent headlines from the Völkischer Beobachter. He reiterated the 4-to-1 casualty ratio 3 times, citing it as proof of the Americans' inherent lack of resolve and the superior fighting spirit of the German soldier. We smeared them, he concluded, slamming his fist onto the table. We bled the Americaner white. The tide has turned here. They are exhausted, confused, and stalled. It was my turn. I stepped forward, holding my clipboard, the cold, hard truth bound in compressed cardboard. General, a tactical summary. I began, striving for a tone that was professional, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. The attack on the Kammerscheid corridor has been repelled. Enemy confirmed withdrawal to defensive lines near Wassenach. Our forward lines hold. I continued, gliding smoothly into the less palatable details. However, the costs incurred require immediate attention. Our current operational strength is 65% of establishment. Of that, approximately 40% are Volksgrenadier recruits who have not fired a rifle outside of basic training, and 15% are recovering from severe trench foot. Effective combat strength is closer to 45%. Dietrich waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense, Klaus. Fighting spirit counts for more than training manuals. Look at the ratios. Proceed. I ignored the interruption. Ammunition expenditure is critical. After the recent barrage, we possess 500 shells for the 10.5 centimeters LUFH-18, translating to a reserve of less than 7 hours of full defensive fire. Fuel reserves are nominal. We have immobilized 2 companies of motorized transport to prioritize supply lines for the forward troops. Our medical situation is stable, but morale is deteriorating due to lack of rations and winter gear. I ended by placing the artillery stock sheet directly under his nose. General, we are operating on credit we cannot repay. We are winning the battles by spending resources that were budgeted for the defense of the Rhine itself. Dietrich leaned back, a flicker of irritation crossing his face, not at the shortage itself, but at my audacity in quantifying it. He was a general who preferred inspirational poetry to actuarial science. Very well, Klaus. Your concerns are noted. But strategy is not merely defensive reaction. It is capitalizing on the enemy's confusion. He then delivered the inciting incident. We will launch a localized counterattack tonight. A thrust from Guy into the American flank. We will seize the initiative, keep them off balance, and prove this is not merely a defensive posture, but a spring of aggressive German spirit. My stomach tightened. General, that attack would require the last intact battalion of the 275th, plus artillery support. Our remaining 88mm shells are positioned for anti-tank defense on the main north-south road. Then reposition them, Oberstleutnant. Dietrich snapped, his voice now steel. Move the 88s forward. They will provide fire support for the infantry thrust. We must hit them hard now. The enemy needs to be demoralized. I want a complete tactical plan on my desk by 1400 hours. This is an order. Are there any further questions? There were no questions. Only the stark realization that the last remaining shield of the division, the ability to repel an armored breakthrough, was now being traded for a doomed, minor act of bravado. He was commanding us to use the oxygen tank to light a celebratory cigar. I picked up my clipboard, the paper rustling like dry leaves. As you command, General. I knew then that my job wasn't just managing the numbers. It was calculating how many rules I could break to prevent my men from being sacrificed for the General's press release. The General's order was a fever dream, but a fever dream required scouting. I grabbed my sidearm, buckled my greatcoat, and told Major Gruber I was heading forward to assess the logistical feasibility of moving the 88s. Feasibility, of course, was a polite military term for impossibility. Stepping out of the bunker was like entering a refrigerator that had been recently coated in pulverized wood and mud. The cold hit instantly, a penetrating, damp chill that promised disease. The sky was the color of old pewter, threatening snow. The Hurtgen forest was not a conventional battlefield. It was a suffocating maze, where visibility often dropped to 10 meters, turning mechanized warfare into a lottery of attrition. Every tree was an artillery magnet, every ravine a potential kill zone. I walked the track toward the main forward supply dump near the road junction, a distance of barely 2 kilometers, which took nearly an hour. The ground was saturated. Decades of leaf decay had turned the soil into a thick, clinging paste that sucked at our boots. This mud was the Americans' true ally. It neutralized their technical superiority almost as effectively as it nullified our meager transport capability. We rounded a bend and stopped. In the middle of the track, half submerged in a crater filled with oily water, lay a Tiger II. It was the pride of the attached heavy company, or what was left of it. The top turret hatch was blown off, likely by an internal fire, and the massive gun barrel pointed uselessly at the gray sky. A haggard engineering sergeant, Schultz, sat on a log nearby, smoking a short pipe. "Report on the 233, I requested, pointing at the ruin. Schultz shrugged, spitting a piece of tobacco. "Not the Americaner, Herr Oberstleutnant. The forest. We got stuck in the bog crossing the creek line. Then the auxiliary engine seized up. We were dead in the water for 6 hours. The crew salvaged the radio and the optics before the P-47s found it." He gestured vaguely at the mangled hull. "Look at that, sir. We could cross Russia, but we can't move 50 meters in the Hurtgen without getting swallowed. Steel means nothing here." He was right. Our most powerful weapons, designed to dominate the open plains of the East, were now little more than immobile pillboxes waiting for a bomb or an engineer team with dynamite. Moving the heavy 88mm guns for Dietrich's ill-conceived counterattack would be a monumental task of engineering and sheer physical labor, guaranteeing they'd be trapped or spotted before they fired a single offensive shot. We continued further, finally reaching a forward listening post. Here, I met the new replacements. They were stacked like cordwood in a hastily dug communication trench, the Volksgrenadier. Boys, barely men. Their uniforms hung loosely on their adolescent frames. They hadn't mastered the art of cleaning their rifles yet. The weapons looked more polished than the soldiers. They carried the distinct, nervous odor of fear mixed with damp wool. Their acting commander was an old hand, an Unteroffizier named Steiner, who looked 10 years older than his actual 30. Steiner's eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the black fatigue unique to men who haven't slept properly in months. "Steiner, report on the new arrivals." "Morale." Steiner straightened up, a gesture of respect that cost him visible effort. "They follow orders, Herr Oberstleutnant. They are willing. They are not soldiers yet. They panic when the mortar rounds land closer than 50 meters. And their primary need? I expected ammunition, perhaps fuel for the small cooking stoves. Shovels, sir. We need proper, robust shovels. The ground is freezing hard at night, and we can't dig in deep enough. The equipment they send us with is junk, and maybe better boots. Half of them are developing trench foot already." I nodded slowly. The Americans were raining down death, and my hardened veteran was asking for simple tools. It was a perfect summation of the German logistical plight. The Reich could still manufacture Messerschmitts, but it couldn't provide a working shovel for the infantry. Steiner looked at me, his gaze cutting through the professional distance. "We hold, sir. We always hold. But if we run into a real assault, we'll break. The forest is killing us before the Americans even get close." I looked back at the terrified, wide-eyed recruits, huddled together like sheep. They had been fed the glorious propaganda of the victory at Schmidt. They believed they were reinforcing a strong, aggressive line. They didn't fear the enemy. They feared the physical, unending brutality of the environment and the nonsensical orders that put them here. I felt the familiar chill that had nothing to do with the weather. My decision about General Dietrich's counterattack was now sealed. Those men were not resources to be spent on a vanity project. They were the absolute, irreducible minimum required to simply maintain life in the divisional shell. Returning to the bunker, the continuous roar of the American guns now sounded less like an attack and more like the inevitable, mechanized grinding of a geological process. My report on logistical feasibility would be truthful. It was impossible. But the subsequent action I would take would be purely insubordinate. I would stall the 88s, claiming the roads were impassable. I had bought Steiner and his boys perhaps a day, maybe two, and I had started down the path of treason. The weather, which had been merely miserable, deteriorated into a weapon of mass destruction. A brutal mix of sleet and freezing rain began falling late that afternoon, turning the churned mud into a black, treacherous ice rink. Visibility dropped further, swaddling the entire front line in a miserable, gray shroud. The conditions should have favored us. Allied ground attack aircraft, the terror of the daylight hours, were grounded. The Americans' massive mechanized superiority should have stalled entirely. But superior resources are designed to weather even superior weather. At 2100 hours, I was monitoring the main communications line, huddled near the sputtering diesel stove in the corner of the bunker. The stove provided more smell, acrid exhaust, and wet leather than warmth, but it was a psychological focus point. The signals officer, Lieutenant Beck, handed me a message slate. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. Herr Oberstleutnant. Report from Army Group B Rear Echelon. Regarding the essential supply convoy, designated Winterfell. My heart sank. Winterfell. That convoy carried the divisional lifeline. Heavy winter parkas, specialized boots, fuel for the remaining few trucks, and, most importantly, the consolidated rations that would keep the men from starving to death on their feet. Its arrival had been promised for dawn. I took the slate. The report was concise and brutal. Convoy Winterfell intercepted 2030 by enemy night fighter patrol, estimated mosquitoes, near Durin. Total loss of all vehicles. No survivors. Enemy air superiority confirmed 24/7. I closed my eyes for a moment. This was not a tactical loss. It was strategic castration. I looked up at the ceiling, feeling the low-frequency vibration of the distant American guns. They had not been grounded. Their heavy bombers and their long-range artillery were simply indifferent to the sleet. But more telling was the Mosquito, a wooden British aircraft, silent and fast, operating at night, deep in German territory. I walked over to the map, tracing the route of the destroyed convoy. It had been hit nearly 50 kilometers behind the supposed safety of the front line. Contact the Luftwaffe liaison immediately. I ordered Beck, the words tasting like ash. Demand confirmation of our night air cover. Demand to know where our fighters were. Beck, knowing the futility of the request, still obeyed. 15 minutes later, the answer came back, as chilling and concise as the initial report. 0 sorties attempted. Weather conditions prohibitive for primary interceptor models. I returned to my desk, sitting heavily. The realization was stark. The American pilot who found that supply convoy did not risk anything but an hour's worth of aviation fuel. He was flying a perfectly maintained machine, produced in a factory where the lights were still burning brightly. He returned to a warm base, a hot meal, and a bed. My men, who had held the line with suicidal courage against overwhelming odds, would now freeze to death in their shallow, waterlogged foxholes, fighting the cold with frayed, summer-weight blankets. Their defeat was being engineered not by machine guns, but by simple, unrelenting deprivation, a deprivation guaranteed by the enemy's complete, risk-free domination of the airspace, day and night. Their air force didn't need to win dogfights. They merely needed to ensure that no German truck, no German rail car, and no German supply chain could ever move unmolested. The victory at Schmidt, the 4-to-1 ratio, the brave resistance, it was all meaningless. We were trapped in a slow-motion siege, and the enemy controlled the tap. I crumpled the convoy report in my hand. We hadn't just lost supplies. We had lost the promise of tomorrow's sunrise. The night deepened, filled with the persistent, whispering sound of freezing rain turning to pellets of snow against the bunker entrance. The static on the radio was a living thing, a restless, scratching noise that amplified the isolation. I was hunched over the main operational map, which had become my personal instrument of torture. I wasn't plotting strategy anymore. I was generating what I mentally termed the heat map of the 275th Division. The map had two distinct areas of focus, contrasting sharply. The zone of darkness, represented by the forward lines. Here, the red and black lines denoting the companies were fading. The temperature was dropping fast. Men were suffering from hunger, extreme cold, and the relentless noise. They were the heat sink, absorbing the impact of the war, rapidly approaching thermal collapse. This zone was Steiner and the Volksgrenadier, asking for shovels and boots. Their operational effectiveness was diminishing by the minute, regardless of how many Americans they killed. The zone of pale light, represented by the division headquarters and rear echelon. Here, the atmosphere was saturated with General Dietrich's furious optimism and the relentless demand for paperwork. This was the zone where victory was manufactured on paper, detached from the physical reality of the front. The only struggle here was keeping the records immaculate for the general's impending self-promotion. It was 2 o'clock hours. The air raid sirens had stopped hours ago, but the American artillery was now working with methodical, brutal precision, a slow, calculated tearing apart of our remaining defensive obstacles. Suddenly, the signals officer, Beck, looked up, his face tight. Herr Oberstleutnant. Priority B message. Direct from General Dietrich. Counterattack order confirmed for 5:30. Full deployment of the 3rd Battalion, supported by all available 88mm assets. Execute immediately. The decision I had been dreading was now unavoidable. The 3rd Battalion was the last viable formation, comprising the few remaining veterans. Sending them out at dawn, across terrain covered in ice and in full view of any lingering enemy reconnaissance, was nothing short of signing their death warrants. All for a symbolic thrust that would accomplish nothing strategically. I looked down at the map, at the fading lines of the 3rd Battalion. If I obeyed, those men would be gone by noon. The divisional shell would crumble entirely. If I disobeyed, I risked the firing squad. The penalty for refusing a direct, written order from the divisional commander in wartime was absolute. My mind raced through the protocols. How could I obstruct the order without technically defying it? The terrain, the weather, the communications failure. I picked up the field telephone, ringing the operations room of Major Gruber. Gruber, I said, my voice low and steady. Prepare a priority A message for General Dietrich's aide, timed for 4 o'clock. The message will read, confirmation of the 3rd Battalion's ability to maneuver. Immediate assessment requested. Roads impassable, ice accumulation severe. Request 12-hour delay to reassess route feasibility for heavy artillery assets. Code, Blitzblind. Gruber paused on the other end. Sir, Blitzblind is only used for total, operational blackout. It is a total operational blackout, Major. I cut him off, my voice barely a whisper. The ground has betrayed us. If the general asks, you confirm that the movement order was received, but the weather has rendered all heavy transport vehicles non-operational. You confirm that the Volksgrenadier are collapsing from exposure, not fighting capability. Frame it as logistics, Gruber, not defiance. Logistics is my responsibility. I take the blame. Understood, Herr Oberstleutnant. You are claiming total road collapse. There was a tone of grudging respect in Gruber's voice. He knew the risk. I put the phone down, feeling the knot in my gut loosen slightly. I had just falsified a critical operational report to save 600 lives. I had won 12 hours. 12 hours for a miracle, or at least 12 hours for the American attack to hit first, overriding the general's vanity project entirely. I returned to the map, feeling utterly isolated. I was a professional soldier who had just committed an act of strategic treason. But as I traced the faint lines of the 3rd Battalion, now temporarily safe in their frozen holes, I felt a peculiar, cold sense of duty fulfilled. My job was not to achieve victory. My job was to manage the inevitable defeat in the most cost-effective way possible. Saving these men, even if it meant my own neck, was the only remaining victory I could claim. The 12 hours I had stolen passed in a haze of mounting dread. General Dietrich's reaction to the road collapse report was predictable. A series of explosive, near unintelligible messages demanding immediate photographic proof of the impassable roads, threatening court-martial for the slightest delay. But the weather had, mercifully, worsened, making forward movement genuinely suicidal and thus confirming my alibi. Just as the sun attempted to penetrate the layer of heavy cloud cover at 9 o'clock hours, signaling the end of my borrowed time, the true, inevitable answer arrived. It wasn't a message, it was sound. The artillery barrage began instantly, without a ranging shot or a preliminary flutter of mortars. It was a solid, continuous wave of concussive force, unlike anything the division had experienced in the Hurtgen yet. This was not tactical fire. This was industrial capacity unleashed. I was standing near the communications array when the first wave hit. The entire bunker groaned, the supporting timbers flexing like bows. Dust and soil rained down from the ceiling. The air pressure dropped so violently that my ears popped, followed by a metallic ringing. Major Gruber, who was meticulously counting the last few shells we possessed for our own battery, dropped his pencil, his face slack with shock. "Heiliger Gott," he murmured, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't merely artillery. This was the sound of the enemy proving my calculations. The earth under us vibrated at such an intensity that standing became difficult. The rumble settled into a terrifying, continuous roar, lacking any discernible pause between the impact of the shells. I gripped the edge of my desk, steadying myself. I started counting in my head, a futile professional reflex. A shell exploded, then another, then 3 in rapid succession, all within 50 meters of the bunker. I stopped counting. It was a waste of breath. "What is the confirmed rate of fire, Lieutenant Beck?" I shouted over the din, my voice raspy. Beck, hunched over the radio, tried to adjust the frequency, pulling noise from the crackling speaker. "Sir, they are reporting saturation fire across the entire divisional front. They cannot pinpoint the origin. It is everywhere." The barrage continued for what felt like an eternity. 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. It was a physical assault on the senses, a relentless hammer blow designed not to kill individual soldiers, but to erase the landscape, to turn the soil into a pulverized mush, to crush the very will to resist. For hours into the firestorm, I finally allowed the professional veneer to crack, staring blankly at the map. This was the moment of revelation. This wasn't anger. This wasn't revenge for their losses. This was pure, detached availability. The Americans were not fighting with passion. They were fighting with tonnage. I pictured the massive shell casings hurtling towards us, the 105s, the 155s. Each shell represented a piece of raw steel, mined, smelted, formed, filled with explosives, and shipped across an entire ocean. This continuous, indifferent volume of fire proved that the supply chain was infinite. I imagined a worker in a Detroit factory, clocking out of his shift at 1700 hours. He drove home in his sedan, listened to the radio, kissed his wife, and had dinner. The shells he helped produce 6 weeks ago were now landing on my head, delivered by men who suffered no shortage, no deprivation, and no fear of air attack. The German army had been taught, since 1918, that the only thing that mattered was the professional soldier's will, the strategic genius of the general stab, and superior tactics. We could fight smarter. We could fight harder. But none of that mattered when the enemy's capacity for murder was bottomless. We had bled the Americans by killing 4 of their men for every one of ours. But for every dead American, a replacement factory in the Midwest simply produced another 5 shells for the next day, another tire for the next supply truck, and another radio set for the next HQ. We didn't bleed them white. We merely absorbed their continuous fire, trading our non-renewable lives for their constantly replenished ammunition. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, colder than the freezing rain outside. Our victory in the Hurtgen was a delusion. We had successfully delayed the inevitable by perhaps 2 weeks, at the cost of crippling our own ability to participate in any subsequent operations. We were not holding the line. We were simply running out the clock on our last breath. When the fire finally lifted, the American infantry wouldn't have to fight. They would simply walk over the pulverized ground and execute the few remaining survivors who hadn't been buried alive. I looked at the trembling young signal officer. He saw a great battle raging. I saw only the balance sheet of the industrial world, and on that sheet, we were already declared bankrupt. The general's phrase echoed in my mind. Now stripped of all glory, we smeared them. No, General. We merely smeared ourselves in the mud, while the American steel cleaned itself off and prepared for the next wave. The American bombardment finally began to taper off after 6.5 hours, shifting from saturation fire to targeted harassment. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a vast, echoing emptiness, suggesting nothing good had survived out there. We managed to establish brief, intermittent contact with the forward positions. The reports were fragmentary, horrifying, inconsistent. Positions obliterated, trenches collapsed, communication lines severed. The 3rd Battalion, which I had saved from the general's foolish counterattack, had been reduced from 600 men to barely 200, simply sitting in place. The American infantry push was imminent. Major Gruber entered my office, his face grim, carrying a small, muddy canvas pack. "Herr Oberstleutnant," he said quietly. "Lieutenant Hessler. Found him near his collapsed command post. He was buried, but the crew managed to dig him out. Too late. We recovered his personal effects." Hessler, one of the Volksgrenadier lieutenants I had seen 2 days ago, a boy with nervous energy and oversized spectacles. He had seemed hopelessly naive, but determined. Gruber placed the pack on my desk. Amidst the wet papers and a cheap leather Bible, there was a letter, sealed and addressed to his mother in Munich. Gruber had left it sealed, awaiting official dispatch. "I must log the contents, sir, before it is sent back," Gruber said, his voice hesitant. "Leave us, Major," I instructed. "I will log it personally." Gruber nodded and withdrew, knowing I needed a moment of professional privacy to deal with the inevitable administrative task of processing the dead. I carefully peeled open the damp envelope. The handwriting was neat, slightly cramped, the ink bleeding in places from the moisture. It was dated yesterday. The opening was a standard reassurance. "Dear Mother, I hope this letter finds you well. I am well, though tired. We have seen tremendous action here, but we are holding. The forest is hard, but we are harder." I skimmed through the details of the grueling conditions, the cold, the lack of food. Then I reached the operational part, the part meant to bring pride to a worried mother in the Reich. "The fighting here has been a glorious victory. We repelled a major attack near Schmidt. Our officers say we killed 4 Americans for every one of ours. They are collapsing, Mother. Their will is broken. They are just boys sent to be slaughtered by the sheer superior quality of the German soldier. We are winning this place. We are showing them what true sacrifice means. We are saving the Reich, 1 meter of soil at a time." I stopped reading, the parchment shaking slightly in my hand. Hessler, the child soldier, had died believing the lie. He had taken his last breath in a collapsing, freezing hole, convinced that his meaningless death was part of a glorious, decisive victory. He died with the general's propagandist rallying cry ringing in his ears. This was the deepest horror of the general's rhetoric. It didn't just mislead Berlin. It deceived the men paying the ultimate price. They believed the ratio was proof of their value, not the accelerating meter counting down to their extinction. They believed the sacrifice was worth it because the enemy was weaker, when in fact, the enemy was simply richer and more patient. If Hessler had understood the truth, that his division was being methodically dismantled to save a few square kilometers of worthless forest, that his death was a necessary statistic to pad a propaganda report, would he have fought with the same fervor? Or would he have saved his last remaining strength for survival? I thought of the true calculation. Lieutenant Hessler, irreplaceable, highly motivated, traded for a few hundred rounds of ammunition that would be replaced within the hour. I reached for the sputtering stove. I held the letter over the flame. The damp paper took a moment to catch, then curled, the ink running into black scorch marks before transforming into ash. I logged it, Major. I'd tell Gruber later. Standard condolences. No operational details. I destroyed the proof of Hessler's brave, heartbreaking delusion. I did it not out of sentimentality, but because the truth of his sacrifice, that it was utterly pointless in the face of limitless industrial might, was too demoralizing, too dangerous, even for the divisional archives. I protected his lie, so the others could continue believing theirs. The battle for the Hurtgen forest was not just about territory. It was a battle for the narrative, and the general, using the blood of boys like Hessler, was winning that internal, necessary war of deception. I was the only man left who knew the score. The relentless grind of the Hurtgen campaign continued into the first week of December. The ground, now frozen solid, had halted the mud problem, replacing it with a far more insidious enemy. Hard, polished ice concealed beneath a light blanket of fresh snow. The 275th Division was a ghost. Our sector was defended by the absolute minimum required to maintain a physical presence. The general, having secured his victory narrative, spent most of his time at Army Group headquarters, lobbying for fresh troops and decorations. My job had become triage, deciding which piece of essential equipment to scrap to keep another running. Then, the strategic shift arrived. A cryptic, highly classified message came down the line. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. A massive, secret counteroffensive in the Ardennes, due to launch imminently. Our divisional designation was on the list. We were not to reinforce the Ardennes thrust, but to be immediately withdrawn from the Hurtgen, leaving a skeleton force behind to cover the shift, and then to be placed in reserve, ready to be rushed to plug any breaches. The order was logical. We were too depleted to attack, but we were the most battle-hardened survivors available to defend. The withdrawal order, however, presented an immediate, insurmountable problem. We had to move our division's remaining heavy equipment 60 kilometers south, through the dense, forested terrain, within 48 hours. I called an immediate staff meeting with Gruber and the Engineering Corps Captain, Schmidt. "We cannot move the remaining heavy artillery or the tanks, Captain," I stated, pointing to the movement lines on the map. "The roads are sheets of ice. Even with chains, a Tiger will slide into a ravine, and a 150 mm howitzer will fracture its axles before it travels 5 kilometers. Captain Schmidt, a pragmatic engineer, nodded instantly. "The risk assessment is catastrophic, Oberstleutnant. We save the equipment, we lose the men to delay. We save the men, we lose the equipment. There is no middle ground." The general, predictably, arrived just hours after the order was issued, full of aggressive bluster about the great offensive to come. "This is our chance, Klaus, to turn the tide. I want every piece of serviceable equipment brought with us. We will need every last shell for the final, decisive battles." "General," I interjected, stepping carefully, respectfully, the roads. "Captain Schmidt confirms the movement of heavy armor is impossible without extensive engineering, which would delay the division by at least 72 hours. That is time we do not have." Dietrich paced the bunker floor, furious at the defiance of inanimate objects. "Then leave behind the trash. But the 88s, the panzers, they must come. If we lose that steel, we lose the capacity to strike back. I will not have my report show a loss of heavy assets due to inclement weather." The dilemma crystallized. General Dietrich valued the reportable asset, the physical presence of a tank or a gun, over the immediate necessity of preserving the human asset, the weary, skilled crew who operated it. To comply with the spirit of the order, we had to leave the heavy equipment. To comply with the letter of the general's demands, we had to sacrifice the men trying to save the steel. I looked at Gruber, who was silently calculating the number of infantry squads we would have to deploy to push the vehicles off the ice, knowing it would be a death sentence from the inevitable American counter-artillery. I made the final mental calculation. The 2 remaining Tigers were useful, yes, but their experienced crews, some of the last veterans of the Eastern Front, were priceless. They could train 100 Volksgrenadier recruits in trench warfare. Dead in a ditch, fighting for a useless vehicle, they were just another casualty statistic. I decided to delay the briefing with the general on the exact disposal plan. I would use the cover of the overall strategic shift to enact my own protocol. I would save the men and let the steel burn. This act of insubordination was no longer about caution. It was about defining the true, salvageable worth of the division. The American response to our subtle movements began at 3 o'clock hours, sharp and immediate. The enemy, sensing the beginning of a withdrawal or a major shift, unleashed a concentrated salvo of mortars, aimed squarely at the established command and supply trails. The headquarters bunker shuddered violently. A large section of the timber ceiling over the radio array finally gave way with a splintering crash. Electrical wires sparked, filling the air with the sharp, acidic smell of ozone and burning plastic. General Dietrich was present, having insisted on overseeing the final coordination of the heavy equipment movement. The crisis of the immediate shelling finally broke his composure. He grabbed the nearest field telephone, his face contorted with panic and fury. "Klaus, where's the 3rd Company? I ordered them to provide cover for the tank crews to retrieve the immobilized panzers." I was directing the signal staff, trying to establish an emergency connection to the artillery batteries, who were now under heavy counterfire. I turned to face the general. He was frantic, his eyes wide, no longer a majestic figure, but a man terrified of losing his reportable assets. "They are moving, General, on foot. Slowly. The engineers are trying to de-ice the road for the Tiger tracks." My lie was measured. Impossible, Dietrich roared, slamming the phone receiver down. They must use the men. Use the infantry. I need 2 companies providing direct cover while the crews attempt recovery. That steel is vital. Get them moving now, Oberstleutnant, before the Americans close the trap. His order was suicidal. Sending 200 exhausted infantrymen, many of them the half-frozen Volksgrenadier recruits, out into a concentrated mortar attack simply to salvage 2 crippled tanks that would never successfully navigate the ice, was madness. It was not strategy, it was a desperate attempt to protect his paperwork from the humiliation of abandoned equipment. This was the culmination of my moral tightrope walk. Obey and sacrifice the last shred of my veteran manpower, or refuse and risk the firing squad. I looked at the general. He was staring at the map, visualizing the shame of the lost tanks, utterly blind to the fate of the men. I made the choice in the sudden, brief lull between mortar impacts. I stepped right up to the general, keeping my voice low, precise, and ice-cold. General, the recovery is cancelled. The crews have been ordered to destroy the tanks and proceed immediately to the designated rally point. Dietrich stared at me, his mouth open. For a moment, he couldn't process the blatant refusal. What did you say, Oberstleutnant? I said. I repeated, raising my voice to cut through the renewed roar of the shelling. That the recovery is cancelled. I have ordered Captain Schmidt to initiate road collapse protocol for the heavy assets. The tanks are already set for demolition. The infantry are moving now, focusing on personnel evacuation. They are not waiting for the tanks. Dietrich lunged at me, his face crimson. You dare defy a direct order. That is treason. I will have you shot. I stood my ground, my professional facade unyielding. I am operating within my capacity as General. The order for Wacht am Rhein specifies rapid consolidation and preservation of effective combat personnel. The preservation of 2 immobilized panzers at the cost of 200 irreplaceable infantrymen is not merely illogical. It is a direct failure of the strategic objective set by Army Group B. I am preserving the nucleus of the division, General, not its scrap metal. The general, sputtering and enraged, reached for his sidearm. Before he could draw it, a particularly violent blast hit close by, knocking him off his feet. He hit the concrete floor with a cry of pain, clutching his arm. General is hit. Major Gruber yelled, rushing to assist him. I didn't move. I saw the general's pained, confused look on the floor. His ego was broken more than his arm. Get the general to the nearest medical officer. I commanded, my authority now absolute. Major Gruber, you are now responsible for the final phase of HQ evacuation. Lieutenant Beck, confirm the road collapse protocol signal with Captain Schmidt. Ensure the demolitions are coordinated. We leave the heavy scrap behind. Priority is personnel. Move. I had used the shell shock and the general's momentary incapacitation to take command. I had committed an act of mutiny disguised as logistical necessity. But the core veterans, the men who had survived the worst of the Hurtgen, were now walking free, saved by a single, insubordinate decision. I could face the firing squad later. For now, we needed to move. The retreat of the 275th Division was not a clean military maneuver. It was an act of desperate scrambling, a shedding of unnecessary weight to gain speed. I left the bunker last, after confirming that the evacuation of the wounded and all essential documents was underway. General Dietrich, his right arm shattered and splinted, had been loaded onto the only remaining serviceable medical vehicle, still muttering threats of court-martial. His will was broken. The myth of the German soldier's superiority was shattered by a single, well-placed mortar round. We walked, the remaining staff and I, joining the stream of exhausted men. The sound of American artillery was fading behind us, replaced by a new, more immediate noise. The sharp, concussive sounds of German engineers executing the road collapse protocol. Boom. A sharp crack, followed by the deep roar of fire. That would be the fuel depot. Boom. The deeper, muffled thud of high explosives. That was the remaining 150 mm howitzer, its barrel uselessly bent by a shaped charge, its breech destroyed. Boom. Boom. Two heavy explosions close together. The Tiger tanks. The final pieces of heavy steel we had sacrificed our logistics for, now turned into useless, burning hulks. I paused at the edge of the forest road, looking back. The Hurtgen was no longer merely a dense, dark place of suffering. It was burning. The engineers were thorough. Fires raged where the supply dumps had been, sending thick columns of black, oil-laced smoke into the gray sky. The flame was vibrant, almost cheerful, a stark contrast to the miserable grays and browns of the December landscape. It was the first time in weeks I had felt real heat. It was the heat of destruction, the temperature of our defeat. I watched a column of infantry pass me, the survivors of the 3rd Battalion, marching quickly, their faces etched with relief. They had abandoned their equipment, but they had their lives, their rifles, and their professional skills. They did not look like men who had just lost a great battle. They looked like survivors of a natural disaster, relieved simply to be breathing. The burning forest seemed to embody the ultimate, bitter paradox of the campaign. We had successfully executed the doctrine of defense in depth. We had exacted a terrible, numerical cost from the enemy. We had successfully reduced the Hurtgen to an unusable wasteland. But in doing so, we had consumed ourselves. The fire was our victory lap. We had denied the enemy resources, but only by first denying them to ourselves. The general had wanted to bleed the Americans white, but the only true bleeding that had occurred was the catastrophic hemorrhage of our own strategic reserves. We had fought with unmatched determination, relying entirely on the superiority of our courage. And we had failed because courage, unlike steel and oil, cannot stop a shell. The smoke carried the scent of burning rubber, oil, and gunpowder, the industrial perfume of war that the enemy could afford to use in abundance, and which we could now only afford to destroy. As I turned to follow the retreating column, the weight of the last few weeks lifted slightly. We had lost the territory, we had lost the equipment, and the general had lost his reputation. But I had saved the essence of the division, the men who knew how to fight and how to survive. Our victory in the Hurtgen was nothing more than an immensely costly delaying action, paid for entirely by the destruction of the very forces needed for the great counteroffensive into the Ardennes, which we were now marching towards. We were trading a localized, tactical success for a strategic, terminal failure. The fire roared behind me, a vast, consuming altar. We left the Hurtgen behind, carrying nothing but our exhausted bodies and the terrible knowledge of our true position in the global tally of war. It was 2 days later. The remnants of the 275th Division, approximately 3,000 men, stripped of all heavy assets, were huddled in makeshift barracks deep in the German rear, awaiting the final orders for the Ardennes operation. The cold was still a constant companion, but here, there was at least the psychological warmth of relative safety and the promise of a warm meal. I sat alone in a temporary office, a former schoolroom, the smell of chalk and old varnish a welcome change from creosote and gunpowder. I was compiling the final operational summary of the Hurtgen engagement for the Army Group Command. General Dietrich, nursing his wounded arm and his shattered pride, was under sedation at a regional military hospital, having been relieved of command pending an investigation into logistical irregularities, my veiled report. The sheet of paper before me was crisp, official. It demanded numbers and conclusions. I began with the American side, meticulously detailing the enemy's operational losses based on intelligence recovered and forward observation. U.S. losses, 275th Sector. Personnel, 3,500 effective combatants removed from the line, Kia, WWII, exposure. Equipment, medium and heavy armor losses negligible, logistical expenditure high. I noted the high enemy personnel losses. This was the statistic the Führer and the propaganda ministry would seize upon. The 4-to-1 ratio. Then our side. German losses, 275th Division. Personnel, 2,150 effective combatants removed from the line, Kia, WWII, exposure. Equipment, total loss of 88 mm and 150 mm batteries, destroyed under road collapse protocol. Total loss of 5 panzers, 3 immobilized, 2 destroyed by enemy action. Division effectively stripped of heavy fire support. The raw numbers told the story of a tactical victory purchased at a strategically ruinous price. But the final section required an analysis of operational effectiveness. Here, I allowed my professional historian's eye to take over, stripping the language of all martial euphemism. I wrote, Conclusion. The The defense of the Hurtgen sector achieved its primary objective of blocking the Allied advance towards the Roer River in the period of October-December 1944. However, the cost of this success was the complete functional degradation of the defending formation. The enemy's expenditure of artillery and air-delivered ordnance during the operation demonstrated an industrial capacity that negated all tactical advantages gained by German defensive skill. The division successfully traded its irreplaceable heavy equipment and its core of veteran manpower for a temporary delay. The cost of this victory is the 275th Division's effective removal from any capacity to conduct decisive offensive operations, rendering it fit only for static defense or use as emergency reserves. I looked at the phrase, "We smeared them," the general's proud proclamation. I picked up my pen and wrote the final summary in my private journal, which would never be seen by Army Command. The Hurtgen was not a battle for ground. It was a battle of consumption. The Americans had infinite resources to consume. We did not. The general's victory narrative was founded on the belief that men's courage could outweigh industrial output. It cannot. Courage is finite. Steel is not. We traded 2,150 irreplaceable lives, 2 years of industrial production, and our future capacity to maneuver for the deaths of 3,500 men who were already being replaced while we were still counting the corpses. We did not bleed the enemy white. We simply allowed their factory to churn through our blood until we ran dry. This was a victory that ensured our subsequent defeat. I closed the journal, sealed the official report, and stood up, zipping my greatcoat. I was still alive. My men were still alive. We were battered, cold, and exhausted, but we were here, poised for the final, desperate gamble in the Ardennes. The bitterest truth of the Hurtgen forest was that survival required not just fighting the enemy, but fighting the delusion of your own command. I had saved the 275th from itself, but what I had saved was only a temporary respite. The factory was still running, and it was coming for us all.